Welcome back to another episode in the Capital Press Club Legacy Podcast Series. I'm your host, Dr. Colin Campbell. It's been a while, and I'm glad and grateful that you are joining us for our latest episode. Of course, I am joined by my man behind the scenes and in front of the camera, but today, for this episode, he's just going to be behind the scenes, Derek Kenny. Derek, how's it going?
It's going well. It's going well. Good to be back.
All right, cool. Hey, we always start out with this day in Black history, and today, actually, really September 3rd, as we are recording this and broadcasting on September 2nd. Many years ago, Frederick Douglass walked to freedom. I don't think I prepared you for this quite yet, Derek Kenny. I know this is our next story, talking about Poynter Institute and how they're partnering with Kansas. But before we get into that, this day in Black history, Frederick Douglass, who we know is an activist, civil rights leader, who has written and talked about his harrowing experience going through slavery into freedom. He actually walked to his freedom disguised as a sailor back in the day. Did you know about this, Derek? This happened back in 1838. Frederick Douglass dressed up as
I didn't know that.
From Maryland to New York, dressed as a sailor. He put on like a tarp hat. He had a neck cloth that he tied around his neck kind of loosely. He had some papers saying that he was free, even though he wasn't really free at the time. And he wore like this red shirt. So he sort of looked like a sailor, I guess, or a ship's mate. And he escaped from England up to New York. And that's how he eventually found his way to freedom. So, grateful to Frederick Douglass. Yeah, there you go, September 3rd. And I'm a Frederick Douglass Fellow right now at Shippensburg University. So this kind of all ties in. It's great to be tied in somehow with that legacy of bravery, his erudite nature, of course, that we all know him for, and a lot of his writings, and of course, sparking these emotions and this movement of freedom for many Black Americans, so much so that we still honor him to this day. And just a shout out to Frederick Douglass, all right, who at one time, I guess, his image was being imagined for some of our currency. I don't know where that movement is now, because I think it was starting to shift to Harriet Tubman. But anyway, he is definitely a revered member of Black society's history, the late Frederick Douglass. So here's to Frederick Douglass. Now, going forward to our next topic, we wanted to bring to you about the topic of Poynter Institute and the media organizer, where they're building an abolitionist newsroom in Kansas City. And so Ryan Sorrell is following Ida B. Wells and Claudia Jones and honoring the legacy of the radical Black press. And even though radicalism and what it means to be radical has taken somewhat of a negative term in some of our pop cultural references or media, radicalism has always been thought of as a present state, as a state of pushing the boundaries of what it means for people to be free, to live their lives as they want to be lived, instead of dealing with sometimes very oppressive conditions. And so challenging the status quo has been in the spirit and the legacy of radicalism, where we know about Ida B. Wells reporting on lynchings. We know about other journalists, Black journalists, who have talked about some of the subjugation that they faced and some of the injustices that they faced in the hands of white oppression. And I believe that Ryan Sorrell is trying to vacillate whether or not he is a bona fide journalist or if he's more of a journalist activist. And I think when you're speaking about the Black experience, there's always an element of activism that's part of it, because there have been so many obstacles that have been put in our place where we've had to have an element of activism, whether we're reporting on myriad topics, because usually there is a level of injustice that's attached to it, whether it's talking about disparities in healthcare, in policing, in education. When you look at the Black experience, there has never been a time when there has been this sort of acceptance and equity among white compatriots. There's always been a fight. There's always been a protest. There's always been some type of resistance against the status quo, so that there could be a better level of self-determination for individuals within the Black diaspora. So in this newsroom, he's an organizer. Sorrell's an organizer who is putting together a newsroom where he wants to really bring to light more of these stories and teachings of the history of the radical black press and showing that there is a precedent for some of this activism that has been a part and an underlying or fundamental space for a lot of black journalists. When they're looking at maybe the dearth of black coaches in the NFL, or when looking at the ways that even black men are dying early. We just lost Fat Man Scoop just a few days ago in his mid
Wow.
50s.
Yeah.
Apparently, yeah, did you hear about that, Derek? Fat
Yeah.
Man Scoop away in
He was
Connecticut.
working, and
And
that's the great fear for many Americans now that you die while working, and well, he was supporting a party, and he was getting the crowd hyped, and
right, the hype
suddenly
man.
slumped over, and that was it.
Yeah, I heard he slurred some words before he passed away. I'm not
Yeah.
sure, or at least before he was hospitalized.
Right.
He was rushed to a hospital, and that happened Friday night, just 3 days ago. But it wasn't reported that he passed away until the following day.
Yeah.
But when you're reporting on issues like that, when it comes to access of healthcare, when it comes to getting the right healthcare, there's usually an element dealing with equality and equity when discussing those who are part of Black society. And in this newsroom, I guess Sorrell really wants to talk about and challenge the traditional journalistic norms within this newsroom. And I think that's where he's trying to thread this needle that I don't know if he needs to be, in my opinion, that careful in trying to thread, as long as he's presenting facts. I think as long as you're presenting facts and you're telling a story, you're doing it in a narrative way, I don't see how that could be antithetical to the institution of journalism. We know that the standardized way in which we do it has been established by the white majority. And so, therefore, does that mean that if you're a member of the black diaspora, that you have to do it exactly like how they do it? Not necessarily. It depends on whether you want to be accepted into certain circles. If you're looking for that Pulitzer Prize, then maybe, yeah, you do have to conform to their standards. But if you're doing it with a different mission in mind to raise awareness, but also to push the boundaries of the status quo so that there can be more equity that will benefit Black society, then maybe a less conventional method needs to be taken on here. And I think that's what Sorrell is trying to do in his newsroom, where he talks about an abolitionist led organization where he challenges some of these notions that have been established by the status quo. He looks at the history of the Black experience, especially when it deals with Black journalists. And he uses that contextualization to report on stories that are still affecting Black society today. So I think that's very important in looking at what Sorrell is trying to do and to see if this would be compatible with other places around the country that are not being covered in the way that legacy media is covering them. We don't really hear about what's happening in Flint that much anymore, or in Mississippi with their water supply, or the fight for reparations in California. What's happening with some of these issues? They seem to be either absorbed by the zeitgeist, where you have more preeminent stories, or they may be just shoved under the rug, right, swept under the carpet, so to
Hmm.
speak. There isn't much attention being brought to them. But we do know that for there to be change, for there to be progress, there needs to be awareness as well. And so I think that's what Sorrell is trying to bring about here. I don't know. What do you make of this, Eric? I think.
It's actually an appropriate time now where it's also about like identifying yourself as to who you are and how you're functioning as a professional. Because we know we are in a time where we have bloggers, used to be called bloggers, or
Right.
influencers that are providing news and news content. We talked about that several times. And I think that what's unique here and what's unique in the past was that the the treatment of African Americans was and also the way they presented the news was different than what the mainstream media was, and that
Right.
And I guess when it comes to American, what is fact is basically the popular consensus as to what things are. So if you are dissenting from those views, or providing different viewpoints, but in doing it using journalistic integrity and the skills associated with being a journalist and being objective. However, the assumptions that you make as a reporter are a bit different in terms of what things are and who people are. It's interesting, and for like Ida B. Wells and others that identified as journalists, I think that means more so that they're not traditionally trained journalists. They didn't go to school. They didn't learn from traditional sources, but they were sharing information that was important to the people that they were reporting to, and also and doing it with integrity. I think it's really implied for journalists that when you present information, you present it with integrity, and that you have the notion of objectivity within what you're doing. And I think the radicalness and the advocacy comes from your story selection, because you're free. You're not. A lot of the major news organizations now seem. I'm not gonna say seem. I'll say seem that some of the news selection of what they're covering is based off of trying to remain solvent as a business, because ultimately a newspaper, TV station, whatever, they're businesses. And so what you cover has to kind of be in line with your business model and help your advertisers feel good about giving you a bunch of money in this very complicated media landscape. So I think I'd applaud him. I'm not sure how unique he is as opposed to many years ago, because now you have so many people providing information of different types. But I applaud him though. I think it's great. I look forward to seeing it and learning more about what this is all about.
Yeah, well, according to the website, Sorrell's work at the Kansas City Defender, he says that first and foremost, describing what he's doing and putting together as a black led abolitionist organization. When he says that they refer to abolition, he says that they mean a world free from imprisonment, from policing and warfare, and then replacing those themes very that are often play out throughout our media. He wants to replace them by life affirming resources like food, housing, healthcare, arts, and education.
Right.
So it sounds like thematically he wants to use something a bit more uplifting. And he's saying that abolition is part of the vision and practically part of the organizing strategy. And then so he says that
Mm.
instead of being just a news outlet, he wants to be a black led power building organization. And I think that what he's doing is he's pulling from different elements from within black communities, from within black society. And instead of the usual narratives prevailing over the black experience and how it's told, he's pulling from other parts of
Mm.
neighborhood activism, from lifestyle. And he's saying this is a more holistic look or a more complete look at the black experience in America. We aren't just about policing issues. We're not just about uh, maybe incarceration issues, if you will.
Right.
There's a lot more to being part of the black diaspora than you would think that's being played out in the media, and that could have other consequences. And I mean consequences not necessarily in a negative way, but just in the reaction. If there were other news outlets that were to talk about the black experience, it's possible that it would shape uh, black communities or the way that black people feel about themselves. One of the things that I talk about sometimes in the classroom is what's called reflected appraisal.
Right.
And it is the context or the notion or the concept rather that people view themselves how they think other people view them. So if you
Huh.
look out into media and look at the imagery, you look for representation of what it means to being a black American, and you just see some crime stories, or you see fighting in a local mall, or these negative depictions. The belief is that over a certain period of time, people will internalize that and act in ways that reflect what they see of themselves in the media, which is usually white led. Yes, we have black people in media as we have other ethnicities, but the ownership we know is predominantly white, if not all white, except for maybe Byron Allen. And I don't even know where he is on that spectrum, right? And so when you're looking at the images that Black people see on a daily basis and how they're portrayed, it may actually weigh into how they view themselves and then reflexively how they interact with the public around them. So I think that what Sorrell is doing here is he's trying to revise that in the spirit of
Mm,
radicalism. When you think about, sometimes it's asked, are you a Black person who is a journalist, or are you a journalist who just happens to be Black? And I think that it's very hard to separate your ethnicity
mhm,
from whatever job you're in. I mean, if you're able to do it, I guess more power to you. But if you're doing it in a mindful way, looking at your life as part
mhm,
of that experience, right? It's very hard to separate yourself and just say, well, I'm a journalist who just happens to be Black. Not if you are reporting on stories like, for example, George Floyd. I think it would be, of course, I'd be able to report on it in an objective way, but at the same time, I know that, my insides would be turning as I see a Black man being murdered
mhm.
by a member of the police force, right? How do I report on that story without feeling some type of emotion tied into it? Regardless of Floyd's background, it
Right.
doesn't matter. Fact is that he was apprehended by a member of the law, by law enforcement, and he didn't live to tell about it. And that's very real, and it's obviously not isolated to George Floyd. If you're a journalist who tells a lot of these stories, who talks about policing, and not all the negative policing ends in death, but if you're talking about that and you cover that, how do you not let it affect you over time? The next time you get pulled over, the next time a police officer comes up to you, do you react in a very naive way, or do you always have it in the back of your mind, some of the stories that you're always covering? And so I think Sorrell is putting this into context, showing that because of the wide breadth of experiences that Black people face,
Mhm.
these are issues, stories, narratives that need to be covered, rather than just the almost the binary of neglect and then crime logs, right? Or somebody in that exceptional story of somebody dealing with an adverse situation, living in some type of poverty situation, but then they were able to succeed in some way. Not that those stories aren't needed, but it almost gives this false notion that there is no systematic oppression, there is no systemic racism there, that as long as you just push yourself, you walk 10 miles to school every day because there's no bus that comes to you or the bus doesn't want to pick you up, you're going to succeed no matter what. I do think that's sort of like a false notion.
Yeah.
And I think Sorrell is bringing some realism to the totality, or he's trying to bring realism to the totality of what it means to be Black and American at the same time. He also quoted Ida B. Wells, and he talked about Claudia Jones, and he said that both of them identified as journalists, but we both know that they had a level of activism with that journalism. And if Ida B. Wells were here today, I'm sure that she would identify as a Black woman first and then a journalist, right? When you're confronted by a police officer, they're not going to take it easier on you because you're a journalist. You know what I mean? They're not going to judge you first based on what they think your occupation is. They see your complexion, they see your gender, and they deal with you how they want to deal with you at that time. And so I think there's a kind of an urgency to what Sorrell is doing here, as far as trying to incorporate uh, experiences that Black people have on a daily basis into journalism and trying to show the world a little bit more of an accurate view and portrayal of Black life in America.
Whoa. And that's positive. I think we talked about the power of media, not just I guess news media, but secular media when it comes to the perception and self perception of African Americans. And I think one thing, if I take away from Howard, if I remember correctly, one of the first things they teach you was what a self fulfilling prophecy was, and that if you believe you are something, then more than likely throughout your life, your actions will um, function in such a way to manifest you to become what you believe you are, or what you believe your potential is as an individual. And what's radical, I guess, about what he's attempting to do consciously, which I believe the Black Press does a good job of, as inherently part of what the Black Press does, is give a bigger, broader picture of African Americans in a different light, and not just the superstar African Americans like Barack Obama or Magic Johnson, or people that are in entertainment or politics of a super hero type icon, and not just a salacious crime blotter, which, of course, across the board is really good for ratings and viewership, because people love what they love. They love the crime blotter, hearing about crime in the neighborhood, crime stats, crime statistics, crime stories, and they also, of course, love the obituaries. But I think it's great that he's looking at the whole of the African American experience, and taking the gamble that he can still run a business and do make that a priority. We've talked in the past about how the Black News Network and other noble organizations were birthed to provide a different look at African America through the lens of journalism, but with a different perspective, and I guess with different goals and perhaps different outcomes. But we haven't seen a model where, well, I don't have a model on top of my mind that's been successful in terms of getting the type of support you need to make it a sustaining business.
Yeah, yeah, and it is important what you said about a self-fulfilling prophecy is having that prediction or that vision of yourself, and through a set of behaviorisms and circumstances, you wind up living out that prediction, right? It kind of reminds me of the tale of Oedipus Rex, which we won't get into, and the canon of Greek mythology.
One of
That's kind of
the,
first learned about self-fulfilling prophecy. Those who are listening to this and watching this, you could look it up about Oedipus Rex.
that's right.
I think, yeah, what he's doing is great. I
Hmm.
do think, like, again, he's doing this to challenge what's already out there. I think he calls it the white imperialist media, and so that has some connotations of sort of the somewhat oppressive but also controlling dynamics of white media. First
Hmm.
of all, just to get narratives out there that are different than the status quo, but also what they talk about and what's acceptable and what's not, right?
Yeah.
We do know that that's control. We do know that just a handful of people control a lot of what we see and what we hear in our media. And I think that he is trying to set up a voice, not necessarily in stark opposition,
No.
but to show an alternative and to show that there's more that meets the eye than what we're already seeing out there. So I
Yeah.
want to say kudos to Sorrell, and I hope that he puts this all together. Kansas City Defender. I guess he's moving his title away from just being a journalist to more of an organizer.
Hmm.
It's almost like a teacher saying that they're more of an educator because there's more involved than just teaching rote memorization or something. There's psychology involved, there's process, there's policy. And so they broaden that term to an educator. I guess he wants to be considered a media organizer, which is commendable. So I look forward to hearing more from Sorrell, who was motivated, by the way, by the Black Lives Matter movement and, of
Hmm.
course, some of the issues that faced those whose lives ended way too early because of police or over aggressive vigilantism
Hmm.
by whites, in various neighborhoods. So it'll be interesting to see what he says because of that motivation and what's at the core of influencing him to take this different direction.
And I'm also interested to see how it's received by the reading public in that area. I definitely see the value in it. Yeah, I believe it's well deserved to have that as top of mind when you're thinking, making decisions about what you're going to cover, what news stories will be on the front page, what will be featured and distributed through your e-newsletters and all those things. Um,
Yeah,
and I think it can have a positive impact on the community, especially when you think about things where you have the questions in the air, like what are black jobs, and
right.
and it shouldn't be it's not a, we know because we work and we're black people, right? But is it a thing where if you're not an African American, you don't know what black jobs are except for what you've seen in the news, in the media, or what you've heard, that's been put out there. So it is important to tell our own stories. It is important to get that balance out there. I think he says some of the mundane things about African American life being shared through his platform, which I think is fantastic.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. All right, so I want to move on to our next topic before time runs out, and that is
Yep.
NVIDIA
Woo-hoo.
partnering with Black Media, which I think is very interesting. NVIDIA, of course, we know that as this behemoth, this technological behemoth that is, in charge of developing AI and chips and different ways that our computers run. NVIDIA is huge. I mean, just last year, they had revenue of about $27 billion. It increased about 126% to about $61 billion this year. And it continues to grow. And it's also the spotlight of some of the, when you regard the tech giants. Well, now they are partnering with Black Media to keep a history of Black media, but also to augment its capabilities. As we know, media in general, especially uh, online newspapers, things like that, that's shrinking. And we do know that the situation is even more adverse when it comes to black media. Well, like we've talked about in previous episodes, artificial intelligence is going to make a profound impact in this industry. Of course, my research stems back to artificial intelligence and some of the caveats that we should be observant of when using artificial intelligence and media. Well, here we have a major organization that's willing to partner with California Black Media, CBM. And Regina Wilson is the executive director of CBM. She has some positive things to say about it. When you look at such an influential company wanting to partner with Black media to affect in a positive way its sustainability and also to augment or to improve its capabilities. That's one thing that artificial intelligence is good for when it comes to media is creating different versions of stories, using being used as a tool, as a resource for reporters for context or for other perspectives that they may not have read themselves or experienced themselves when telling a story. So I think this is going to be very interesting. This is a recent development, so we're not sure exactly how it's working out, but there is a lot of potential there because we know that artificial intelligence and its integration in various industries is only growing. Derek, you are familiar with artificial intelligence and the
Oh
way
yeah.
that it's improving media. Maybe you have some insight into this as well.
I do know that when it comes to artificial intelligence, it is what it eats. So if you don't feed it information about the black experience, you don't share information from African American journalists that may have a different perspective, then that won't be integrated into the future iterations of what AI presents to the world. So when the world asks questions that are significant or specific to our community, the answers won't be as comprehensive because they won't include our voices. And this is a chance for us to have our voices included in that, but also to amplify our voices and to identify sources for news for and about African Americans, and not necessarily for African Americans anymore, because I know that, or I'm aware of a few black newspapers whose audiences are broader now, even though their subject matter is focused on areas of the geographic areas that happen to be composed of majority African Americans. Their readership is expanding beyond African Americans, but I believe it does justice to the future of AI, where there's been concerns about being able to properly identify the facial recognition when you're using facial recognition software between two African Americans. It has been shown that AI was not able to make that distinction, um, and it's a thing where even if you use different versions of AI, if what's it called? If you use version 3 as opposed to version 4, then your information might be based off of the previous year's information as opposed to the most current
You're talking
information.
about automated. You're talking about
Chat
Chat
GPT.
GPT
Yeah.
automated. I think that's is it automated insights.
Yeah.
It does.
So if you ask ChatGPT a question, or you're asking a question, it'll be based off of what is consumed up to what is consumed. And if it's only consumed information up to the previous 2 years, then your answers will be incomplete because it won't consider the most recent information. And that's the same thing when when you're looking for information about certain things, you don't have a complete uh, view of what it might be because you don't have all the voices being heard. And I think this is wonderful that an organization that's so tech heavy and on the cutting edge of tech is also sensitive to the need to support these voices and integrate them into some of the benefits that's brought about by the computing power of NVIDIA and the service power of generative AI. So I'm excited about
Yeah.
it. I thought this is great, and hopefully that will continue. I know it's always good for big business to be a good corporate citizen, and I think this is an example of that. But I think this is a bit more of a thoughtful approach to supporting organizations that benefit the community in such a way as Black Media in California.
I totally agree, Derek. And with that, we will conclude our podcast. I think it's really interesting that they're also partnering with members of the educational realm as well. So it's not
Yeah.
just journalists, but also students in California. So there seems to be a lot of great potential here. Well, we look forward to seeing how this all works out. And I want to thank all of you for watching us here for our latest episode of the Capital Press Club Legacy Podcast. I'm Dr. Colin Campbell, and we'll see you next time. Shout out to Derek.
All right.